The GM rolls initiative. You're going first in the turn order. There are 6 enemies, all standing pretty damn close to one another, and finally the barbarian is not standing right in the middle of them, ruining your fun. All of these enemies are also of a lower level than you. This is it. This is your moment. I cast Fireball! No, you don't, because this is Pathfinder, and I'm here to ruin all of your fun. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pathfinder, the home for every math nerd's Pathfinder optimization needs. If you're new here, welcome, and I hope you're here to stay. If you've been here before, welcome back. Before I get started, I wanted to give a big thank you to Dan Talks Games, and also to other people who've been promoting my content over on Reddit, Twitter, etc. I was planning on giving you guys a 100 subscriber special in early November-ish. Now we're at 6 times that number 2 weeks before this video has even come out. So I promise I'll try and get some special goodies out for you guys by November, maybe for a 1,000 sub special. But right now, I don't think I'll be able to do that. For now, you have to settle for my standard content. On to the video. I have a feeling that today's video is gonna ruffle a lot of feathers. We need to talk about AoE spells. When it comes to area damage, spells like Inner Radiance Torrent, Fireball, Chain Lightning, and others like them get a lot of attention. These spells are big, they're flashy, and they're iconic. People love using them. And when people love using something that's iconic, it creates certain blind spots. I think the spell Dehydrate sits very cleanly inside one such blind spot. So to start, let's look at the Dehydrate spell itself. It's a rank 1 spell, available to Arcane and Primal. It's got a pretty short range and a small area of effect. It is worth noting, however, that every 2 ranks, this area becomes a little bit larger, so this area is not going to stay small forever. All creatures in this area make a basic Fortitude save to take 1d6 persistent fire damage, and then anyone afflicted by that fire damage has a chance of becoming enfeebled each turn that they take that fire damage. Finally, as it heightens, it also deals quite a bit more persistent fire damage than before. Evaluating it at face value, Dehydrate looks like it's just a pretty good rank 1 AoE spell, but I think the blind spot shows up when thinking about it in comparison to things like Fireball or Chain Lightning at higher ranks. It's often assumed that those spells are best in slot for their ranks and automatically outclass Dehydrate. I don't think that's true. I think Dehydrate is worth using all the way up till its highest ranks, and hopefully today I show you why I think so. For completeness, let's also show you Fireball and Chain Lightning. Fireball is as simple as it gets, pretty large range, 20-foot burst, 6d6 fire damage with a basic reflex save, heightens by 2d6. Chain Lightning is a little bit more complex. You'll note that it does a lot more electricity damage at its rank compared to Fireball. Fireball is rank 3 and Chain Lightning is rank 6. It also has the same basic reflex save, but it comes with a twist. If a target crit succeeds, the Chain Lightning stops. It doesn't matter how many targets you've hit, it just stops. If it doesn't crit succeed, it can keep going. It's not restricted by the size of an AoE template. It can ignore your friends. As long as an enemy doesn't crit succeed, you can hit a theoretically infinite number of targets. So Chain Lightning is quite different from these other 2 spells, and I'll get into when it's a good spell and when it's not, but it's just worth keeping in mind. It's a pretty good AoE spell, and of course, it heightens by 1d12 every rank. Now, I do want to make it clear, when I say I'm trying to show you that Dehydrate is worth using over these 2 other spells, that doesn't mean these 2 other spells are bad. Fireball is a great spell. Chain Lightning is an incredible spell. It's just Dehydrate is also a very good spell, and it's always worth considering because it comes with upsides that may not be obvious right away. So here's the setup for the scenario where I'll show when and why Dehydrate is worth using over its alternatives. The party is a party of level 11 adventurers, and I do want to note I chose level 11 on purpose. Level 11 means your maximum rank slot is rank 6. Dehydrate only heightens it at odd ranks, so I purposely gave Dehydrate a little bit of a nerf just to show that it's still a worthy contender. If this was level 6, it would have an even stronger claim to be the better spell to be used. So level 11 party, I have given them a severe threat encounter against 6 different level 9 foes. These are Urna Curses, and they're a pretty deadly set of foes to be facing, so it's a serious enough encounter to warrant the use of resources. Finally, I am assuming the spellcaster is a plain old wizard, so no damage boosts like Sorcerous Potency, Foretell Harm, Unleash Psyche, etc. are getting involved. I find that it's easier to compare spellcasters this way because once you start involving those kind of push you towards one or the other option. For example, if a damage boost says you shouldn't use a spell with the duration, clearly Fireball is the better option than Dehydrate. I don't think Dehydrate would even be a contest then. So this is for characters who don't necessarily have those options. Your druids, your wizards, etc. Let's say Ezrin, our wizard, has 1 initiative and is able to drop an AoE. You'll note that a 15-foot burst and a 20-foot burst will both get all of these Arena Curses, and they won't hit any of your friends. So that is not a consideration here. However, when looking at this map, any level 11 wizard is going to ask themselves a question. Before getting into Dehydrate, Fireball, or any other spell with a burst, we have to answer the burning question of every single level 11 wizard in existence. Why don't we just use Chain Lightning? It is a really good spell. It does so much more damage than a Fireball at the same rank. It ignores your melee allies, which means you don't have to win initiative like I set up in this scenario to have a really good chance of hitting everyone. And similarly, since it can just bounce to anyone within 30 feet, it's really hard for the enemies to array themselves in a way where you can't hit all of them. The big downside is that little chance that one crit success will just stop your Chain Lightning. Let's look at the stats of these Arena Curses. It's a plus 18 reflex, and your spell save DC is 30. There were 6 of these Arena Curses to work with. But Pathfinder, they only could succeed on a natural 20. Why are we worrying so much about a 5% chance of crit success? We're worrying so much because a 5% chance of a crit success is being repeated target by target by target. So the formula I've put up there is a probability that the nth target has crit succeeded, which means all the targets after n will take 0 damage because they never even have to attempt the saving throw. You're done using the spell. The probability is going to be 95% to the power of n minus 1 multiplied by 5%. This intuitively makes sense because n minus 1 targets have to get that 95% chance of not crit succeeding, and then one person has to get the 5% chance of crit succeeding, and they have to be the last in the chain. That's how this formula comes about. What that translates to is this graph. The x-axis marks the number of targets you got to before the final one crit succeeded. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You will see that there's a 5% chance that the very first crit succeeded. If they don't crit succeed, there's a 4.75% chance that the second crit succeeded. So on and so forth until the 6th one. Draw this little red box around 1, 2, 3, 4, and what this is telling you is the probability that 3 or more targets will take 0 damage from your Chain Lightning out of these 6 targets. Add them all up and they seem to be very close to 20%. That's an incredibly high chance to be taking the risk for. You're taking a merely 20% chance that more than half of your targets just do not take any damage. Are those odds you would accept if this is a really difficult fight and you really need to do that damage? Of course, we have to also compare what Fireball looks like. Does Fireball also have that humongous chance? So Chain Lightning has an 18.55% chance of failing to affect 3 or more targets. And if we work out the math on Fireball, it's actually a lot lower than this 18.55%. The formula for half or more of your targets failing to take any damage for Fireball is not going to look like it did for Chain Lightning because the success of one target has no bearing on whether any other takes damage. What you will get is a binomial distribution. So in this formula, the leftmost term is a summation from 3 to 6. We'll get back to that later. Focus on everything from C onwards first. The first term says 6 choose I. What that means is the number of different ways you could select I out of 6. For example, in a list of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you could select 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, 6, 1, 3, 4, etc. There's a mathematical formula for how many different such combinations exist. The remaining 2 terms are very similar to what you saw earlier. 5% to the power of I times 95% to the power of 6 minus I. And then that summation term we'll get back to is because when I is 3, you're seeing the chance of 3 crit successes. When I is 4 is 4 crit successes. Add up all the possibilities from I equals 3 to 6, and you'll get the probability of 3 or more crit successes. 2.23%, nearly 8 times lower of a chance than Chain Lightning to just fail to affect half or more of your targets. And you don't actually need to do that complex math to verify this 2.23%. There's something called a binomial distribution calculator. I will link it in the chat, and it will just tell you the probability of 3 or more crit successes if you use it correctly. 8 times likelier of a chance for Chain Lightning to just fail to affect half or more of the targets. And of course, I've been assuming that the enemy had a plus 18 reflex, which is pretty moderate for its level. If the enemy had a plus 21 to their reflex, which is just high for their level, Chain Lightning would have even worse of a time, because now the first one has a 10% chance of succeeding, the second has a little less than 10%, so on and so forth. It would work out to being a lot worse than Fireball in that scenario. So Chain Lightning is not a bad spell. I have to keep emphasizing that. It comes with so many upsides, but that upside is offset to some extent by this pretty humongous downside that the majority of the targets you're choosing to target may just not take any damage. And in a severe fight like the one that I drew out on the map earlier, you may not be willing to take that risk. So in my previous 2 slides, I showed that burst spells, whether it be Fireball or something else, are still worth considering over Chain Lightning. Chain Lightning is not always the answer, despite how much I would love it if it was. You should be considering Fireball, and therefore you should be considering Dehydrate, which is also a burst spell. But what about Dehydrate compared to Fireball? There's no reliability difference in terms of the AoE template or the targeting itself. There might be based on the save, so now we will look at the saves of what we're targeting. The Urna Curses have a plus 18 reflex, plus 20 fortitude. Your spell save DC is still 30. This is what that looks like visually. Dehydrate only sees crit fails on a 1, Fireball sees them on a 1 or a 2. Dehydrate only sees fails on a 2 to 9, Fireball sees them on 3 to 11. Successes on 10 to 19 versus 12 to 19, a significant difference, and then crit success on just a natural 20. These probabilities create what's called a multinomial distribution, which is a generalization of the binomial distribution I talked about earlier, but I think that might be a little more complex than we want to get into. So do we want to do a DPR analysis? Not even slightly. Taking a mean average just kind of erases away too much context, in my opinion. If you work out the numbers, you take a weighted average of each of those ranges and the probabilities to convert to, multiply them by either 2x, 1x, 0.5x, or 0x, the amount of damage each of these spells do, you can get a DPR kind of number out of it. And even for Dehydrate, which deals persistent damage, you can use a geometric sequence to average what the damage will look like over, say, a 3-round combat. It's not like persistent damage is not tractable with mean analysis. The problem is it just doesn't make any sense. When I worked out the numbers, I got Fireball gets a mean damage of 214.2 or 36-ish per character. Per target, sorry. And Dehydrate gets a 241.45 or 40-ish per target. What does that mean? You're not actually dealing 36 damage to every single Urna Curse with the Fireball, nor are you dealing actually 40 damage to every single Urna Curse with a Dehydrate. And in fact, with the Dehydrate, you have no control over which one loses the persistent damage and which one doesn't, because every time you take persistent damage, there's a 70% chance you just don't take any more persistent damage. So that multinomial distribution I talked about earlier, its swinginess with the game is kind of underrepresented if you just try to flatten it out with a mean. So instead, I'm just going to roll 6d20, see how this plays out. The results I got are 1, 2, 9, 12, 16, and 19. Convert that into outcomes, and the Fireball sees 2 crit fails, 1 fail, 3 successes. Dehydrate sees 1 crit fail, 2 failures, and 3 successes. So I am not artificially suppressing the amount of damage Fireball would do here. There is a tangible difference in these 2 rolls. My roll is representative of Fireball's upsides. That upside may have shown up elsewhere. For example, instead of changing 1 failure into a crit fail from Dehydrate to Fireball, we would have changed 1 success into a failure. But that advantage is representative of these outcomes. I'm not artificially making Dehydrate look any better. How do these numbers convert to actual play? So looking back at the example I set up, a fireball would probably have a slightly bigger AoE template than this. It will still hit all 6 targets, so it doesn't really matter. Let's assume exactly average rolls. So the fireball does 42 damage on your 12d6. 2 of them would take double the damage. 1 of them would take full damage. And 3 of them would take half the damage. So what does that look like in terms of actual party tactics now? What you'd probably have is the marshals would gang up on the ones that are at lower health, these 2. Meanwhile, the remaining 4, the wizard and the cleric would continue poking away with cantrips and or other spell slots. Once these 2 are dealt with, the rogue and the fighter would then move on to whoever's most injured, trying to focus fire them down. The idea is you take them out of the action economy, the fight gets easier and easier as you go on. However, when you look at the actual effectiveness of the strategy, it leaves a little to be desired. Ignore the crit fails. So let's say we assume the rogue and the fighter will be able to just work down the crit fail targets on round 1, which is not a guarantee. There's still 503 HP to work through after considering those crit fails. And that's a lot of HP. You're not likely taking down one character every single round for the rest of combat. What happens with Dehydrate is a little bit more subtle. 1 of them crit failed, so I don't know, let's say it's this one. Then 2 failed. This is the damage they'll be taking only on that first round of combat, right after the persistent damage was applied. What happens now is on each time one of these takes damage, there's a chance it'll expire. The idea is that Valeros, Mauricio, and the remaining 2 characters should all focus a target who has succeeded that 70% chance of the persistent damage going away. Let's say it's this one. All 4 of them are now going to focus this one target. The remaining ones will keep taking damage from Dehydrate. They'll keep damaging you, but they will keep taking damage, and they'll keep getting enfeebled along the way, hopefully. Once you've worked through this one, you target another one who is no longer afflicted by Dehydrate. You might even get lucky. If the one that crit failed that first check never recovers from persistent damage, you never have to hit him. Each tick is doing nearly a third of their health bar. They might just die without ever having taken a hit from one of your marshals, while you are also softening up the rest of these targets for your marshals. So that is how you would use Dehydrate against this encounter that I set up. You would focus the ones who have already passed their flat check, and then Dehydrate's passive income along the way will just help you a lot. And it'll actually let you bring more of your party's force to work on the targets that need working on. Because in the fireball scenario, only Valeros and Mauricio were working on the targets that are at the lowest health. Ezrin and Kyra were actually responsible for softening up the rest of the targets. And I'm looking just from a pure damage perspective, but remember that Urna Curses and most monsters in Pathfinder don't just do damage to you while you do damage to them. Urna Curses specifically, for example, have a unique thing where every time they hit you with a tentacle, there is a chance that you'll be stunned. Having something that keeps doing work while your party is not at full capacity, while your party is playing in recovery mode, makes Dehydrate a really strong spell to consider here, whereas Fireball doesn't have that advantage. Is Fireball just a bad spell then? Not at all. Fireball clearly does have an advantage. It did a ton of upfront burst damage, and some party compositions just prefer that. Dehydrate had the advantage of doing better sustained damage. Dehydrate just happens to be an underrated spell, which is why I'm presenting it in the scenario where it beats Fireball. The truth is you have to consider both of them, and more importantly, you consider both of them in context of your party. Remember what I said earlier, optimization in Pathfinder always has to be done with your party in mind. If your party is very burst damage focused, let's say instead of Valeros and Mauricio, your frontliners were a Giant Instinct Barbarian and a Starlit Span Magus. You use Fireball. You're going to soften up targets so much for them. They might one-shot the ones that crit failed and have actions to spare for everyone else, depending on the exact ordering and where they were able to stand and their reach and range and all other such factors. You'll also be able to soften the other targets up more effectively with even just cantrips, because again, these guys are burst damage focused. But on the other hand, if your party looks something like Sword and Board Fighter in the front line, and a Flurry Ranger using a longbow in the backline, and then say instead of Kyra being a Cloistered Cleric, you have a War Priest Cleric, this party clearly cannot bring burst damage to boot. So you bring sustained damage. You help them by sustaining damage on the targets they're not sustaining damage on, and by contributing your action economy to taking down the targets they are focusing on. Now, there are a few more considerations for why Fireball may not necessarily be as good as Dehydrate. First, remember that Dehydrate is a bit more flexible than Fireball. If you bring Fireball to a situation where it's not an AoE damage fight, it's a single target damage fight, Fireball does embarrassingly low damage for single target spells. Dehydrate, on the other hand, doesn't, because when you sustain this damage round after round, there's a really nice chance that you might do single target levels of damage, just the way Chain Lightning does. So Dehydrate shares that advantage of Chain Lightning. On top of that, if we had done this comparison at level 13, Dehydrate definitely wins more cleanly because it's heightened a lot better than Fireball has. But it's worth noting that this is also the level at which Eclipse Burst is going to eclipse Fireball's performance. It's going to do 18d6 damage compared to Fireball's 14d6. So it's not so cut and dry. Every rank will give you spells that are always worth considering for burst damage, for sustained damage, and so on and so forth. It's just always a consideration. You always look at all your options. You always talk about all your options. You always think about how they affect your party and how they affect this specific encounter. So all in all, Dehydrate is a fantastic spell. I think it's always worth considering in an AoE situation. I think it's always worth thinking that it's not as bad in a single target situation as a lot of other AoEs, but still often being as good an AoE as those other AoEs. It works better if your party likes sustained damage, but worse if your party likes burst damage, and like all optimization in Pathfinder, you think about your party. The takeaway here is that Dehydrate is an underrated spell that I hope more people consider at higher levels of play. That is all for today's video, folks. I hope you like my content, and I hope that if you do, you like, subscribe, and come back for more in the future. Feel free to leave comments if you agree or disagree, or if you have just any general feedback. I'm always happy to chat. Until next time.